Part 1. The package nobody expected. The most dangerous family secrets are not the ones you discover. They are the ones someone spent a lifetime trying to hide. It had been almost a year since I walked out of that Connecticut hospital carrying my mother's letters and a sense of peace I never thought I would find. For the first time in decades, my relationship with my father had become something resembling normal. We were never especially close, but we spoke more often. We shared Sunday phone calls. Occasionally we even laughed. Richard and I had also found common ground after the truth about the family business came to light. Life was not perfect, but it was quieter, more honest. I truly believed the hardest chapter of my family's story had finally ended. That belief lasted until a gray Tuesday morning in October. The air outside was cool, and orange leaves covered most of my driveway when a delivery truck pulled up in front of my house. I was working at my kitchen table when the doorbell rang. The package was small, no larger than a shoebox wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address. What caught my attention was the label attached to the front. It had my full name typed neatly across the center. Beneath it were 4 words that immediately made my heart race. Personal delivery. Estate release authorization. I carried the package inside and placed it on the table. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Something about it felt familiar. Eventually I opened it carefully. Inside was a thick manila folder and a handwritten note attached to the top. The moment I recognized the handwriting, I stopped breathing. It belonged to my mother. My hands trembled as I unfolded the note. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The ink was faded but still clear. The message was short. Emily, if you are reading this, then circumstances unfolded exactly as I feared they might. There are truths I never finished uncovering. The envelope I left behind was important, but it was not the end. If you wish to understand our family completely, begin with the notebook. Love always, Mom. I read the note 3 times. Then I carefully opened the folder beneath it. Inside rested a black leather notebook. It looked old. The edges were worn. Several pages were marked with colored tabs. I immediately recognized my mother's meticulous style. Throughout my childhood, she had documented everything. Grocery lists, family vacations, important dates. But this felt different. The first page carried a title written entirely in her handwriting. Questions that never went away. A strange feeling settled over me. My mother had passed away years earlier. The letters she left behind had already changed everything I thought I knew about my family. They had exposed financial secrets, hidden sacrifices, and years of misplaced credit. What more could possibly remain? I opened the notebook and began reading. The first few pages contained dates stretching back more than 15 years. There were references to conversations, appointments, legal records, and meetings with people whose names I did not recognize. Some entries were only a sentence long. Others filled entire pages. As I continued reading, one phrase appeared again and again. Walter refuses to discuss it. Several pages later I found another. He still carries the guilt. Then another. The truth existed long before Emily was born. I slowly lowered the notebook. My father had spent decades hiding one enormous secret. We had already uncovered it. Or at least I thought we had. Yet according to my mother's notes, she had been investigating something entirely different. Something older. Something she believed explained many of the choices my father made throughout his life. Outside, the wind rattled the trees. The house felt unusually quiet. I turned another page and found a folded document tucked between 2 entries. Written across the top in my mother's handwriting were 6 words that immediately sent a chill through me. Start here if I am gone. In that moment I realized something unsettling. The envelope that changed my life a year ago had not contained the whole truth. It had only opened the first door. Part 2. My mother was investigating something. The first page behind the folded document contained a sentence that immediately made me sit down. Your father is not hiding what happened. He is hiding why it happened. I stared at those words for a long moment. For years, I had believed the mystery surrounding my father revolved around the family business. That secret had already been uncovered. We knew where the money came from. We knew how the truth had been buried. We knew why he carried guilt. Yet my mother's handwriting suggested that entire chapter had merely been a symptom of something much older. I unfolded the document carefully. It was not a legal record. It was a list. My mother had organized it the same way she organized everything important in her life. Names, dates, locations, questions. Several entries had been highlighted in yellow ink. The first name meant nothing to me. The second name was equally unfamiliar. The third made me stop. It was the name of a small Connecticut town nearly 60 miles from where I grew up. Beneath it, my mother had written a note. Walter visited repeatedly between 1971 and 1974. Refuses to explain why. I turned the page. More notes appeared. Some referenced conversations with lawyers. Others mentioned hospital archives and public records offices. One entry had been circled several times. He thinks protecting everyone requires silence. Another note beside it read, I no longer believe silence is protecting anyone. A chill moved through me. This did not sound like a woman investigating finances. It sounded like a woman trying to understand her husband. The more I read, the more I realized my mother had spent years pursuing answers. She was not looking for money. She was looking for a story. Around noon I made coffee and continued reading at the kitchen table. Outside, leaves drifted across the backyard. Inside, my mother's notebook slowly revealed a side of her life I had never known existed. There were detailed records of phone calls, addresses written in careful handwriting, appointment dates, library visits, requests for archived documents. She had become an investigator. Then I reached an entry dated approximately 3 years before her death. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed. Today I finally confirmed the date. Walter was there. Everything changed after that. I frowned. There was no explanation attached. No description. No details. Just those few sentences. Several pages later, I discovered another entry that seemed even stranger. If Emily ever learns the truth, she may finally understand why her father keeps her at a distance. My stomach tightened. I read the line again. Then again. The words refused to make sense. My father and I had already confronted years of favoritism. He had admitted his mistakes. He had apologized. We had begun rebuilding our relationship. Why would some hidden event from decades earlier explain the way he treated me? The question stayed with me throughout the afternoon. By evening I had covered nearly half the notebook. Most entries raised more questions than answers. Then near the back I found a section separated by blue tabs. Unlike the earlier pages, these entries focused on specific locations. The same town appeared repeatedly. The same names surfaced again and again. There were references to a church, a hospital, and an old county records office. Tucked between 2 pages was a faded receipt from a hotel dated more than 40 years earlier. My mother had written a note across the top. This was where I finally found the first witness. Witness. The word sent another chill through me. Witness to what? I searched the next several pages hoping for an answer. Instead, I found only one final note written in bold letters. If I do not finish this investigation, start with the town. Someone there still remembers. The room suddenly felt smaller. The notebook rested open in front of me while the evening sky darkened outside the windows. For nearly a year, I had believed my family's secrets were finally behind us. Now I was looking at evidence that my mother had spent years chasing another truth entirely. And according to her notes, somewhere in a quiet Connecticut town, there was still someone alive who knew exactly what my father had spent half a century trying to forget. Part 3. The name that should not exist. I left early the next morning. The notebook sat on the passenger seat beside me as I drove through winding Connecticut roads lined with brilliant autumn colors. My mother's notes had given me a destination but very few answers. The town was small, the kind of place people drove through without noticing. It sat nearly 60 miles from my home, and looked as though time had moved more slowly there. A white church stood near the center of town. A diner occupied the corner across from a row of brick storefronts. The courthouse appeared older than almost every building around it. According to my mother's notebook, this was where everything had begun. I parked near the town records office and carried the notebook inside. The building was quiet except for the sound of pages turning somewhere in the back. A woman in her 70s sat behind a wooden desk. After introducing myself, I explained that I was researching family history. She smiled politely and directed me toward several public archives. For the next 3 hours, I reviewed old directories, newspaper records, property files, and community documents. Most of what I found seemed ordinary. Then shortly after noon, something unusual appeared. One name from my mother's notebook surfaced inside a county registry record from 1972. The name belonged to a woman I had never heard before. What caught my attention was not the woman herself. It was the address listed beside her name. The street belonged to the same neighborhood where my father had apparently spent considerable time according to my mother's notes. I copied the information and continued searching. As the afternoon progressed, additional references appeared. The same woman appeared in church records, then in local newspaper announcements, then in several community event listings. It was clear she had once been well known in town. Yet nowhere could I find any obvious connection to my father. Frustrated but determined, I stopped at the local diner for coffee. While reviewing my notes, I noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the counter watching me with curiosity. Eventually he approached my table. "You look like somebody," he said. I smiled politely. "That happens sometimes." He studied my face for a moment. Then his expression changed. "No," he said quietly. "You really do." Something about his reaction made my stomach tighten. He introduced himself as Frank. He had lived in town his entire life. When I mentioned the woman's name from the records, his eyebrows immediately rose. "I have not heard that name in years," he said. My pulse quickened. "Did you know her?" He nodded slowly. "Everybody knew her." I opened my notebook. "Did she know a man named Walter Parker?" The coffee cup in his hand stopped halfway to the table. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he carefully lowered the cup and looked directly at me. "Walter Parker?" he repeated. "You're Walter Parker?" The fact that he recognized the name instantly sent a chill through me. "Yes," I answered. Frank leaned back in his chair. His eyes narrowed as though he were looking through decades of memories. "Well," he said finally, "there is a name I have not heard in a very long time." My heart was pounding now. "What can you tell me?" He hesitated. "Not much anymore. Most people involved are gone." Then he studied my face again. "Longer this time. What exactly is your connection to Walter?" I swallowed. "He is my father." The man's expression shifted immediately. Surprise gave way to something that looked almost like recognition. He stared at me for several uncomfortable seconds. Then he quietly said the words that would stay with me for the rest of the day. "That explains it." My mouth went dry. "Explains what?" Frank glanced toward the diner window before looking back at me. "You have her eyes." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. "Whose eyes?" I asked. The elderly man remained silent. Then he slowly spoke a name I had never heard before. It was the same name that appeared throughout my mother's notebook. And according to the look on his face, whoever that woman had been, she was somehow connected to my father, my mother, and a secret that had survived for more than 50 years. Part 4. The Woman Who Knew My Mother. For several seconds after Frank spoke the woman's name, neither of us said a word. The sounds of dishes and quiet conversations around the diner seemed to fade into the background. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Finally I leaned forward. "Who was she?" I asked. Frank sighed and glanced toward the front window, where autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. "She was one of the kindest people in this town," he said. "Everybody knew her. Everybody respected her." That was not the answer I needed. "How did she know my father?" Frank hesitated. "That is a long story." I opened my mother's notebook and showed him several pages. The moment he saw the handwritten notes, his expression changed. "Your mother came here too, did she not?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Years ago." He smiled sadly. "I thought so." She asked many of the same questions. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you tell her what you know?" He shook his head. "Not everything. Back then it was not my place." The disappointment on my face must have been obvious because he immediately added, "But there is someone you should meet." He reached into his wallet and removed a worn business card. On the back he carefully wrote an address. "She was your mother's closest friend during the last years of her life." I recognized the name immediately. It appeared several times throughout the notebook. My mother had spoken with her repeatedly. "Do you think she knows what happened?" I asked. Frank nodded slowly. More than anyone still living. I left the diner less than an hour later and drove to the address. It was a modest white house located on a quiet road lined with maple trees. The woman who answered the door looked to be in her late 70s. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her eyes carried the calm confidence of someone who had seen a great deal of life. The moment I introduced myself, her expression softened. "Emily," she said. "I have been wondering if this day would ever come." A chill ran through me. She invited me inside. Photographs covered the walls of her living room. Several included my mother. Seeing those familiar smiles immediately brought back memories. We sat together near a large window overlooking the backyard. For a few moments we spoke about my mother. Then I carefully placed the notebook on the table between us. The woman's eyes settled on it instantly. "She never stopped looking for answers," she said quietly. "Not even near the end." I swallowed hard. "Answers about what?" She looked at me. For a long moment. "About your father." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. "Everyone keeps saying that," I replied. "But nobody will tell me what it means." The woman folded her hands together. "Because the truth belongs to more than one person." Then she surprised me by reaching into a nearby cabinet and removing a small envelope. The paper looked old. Very old. She handed it to me carefully. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 4 words that immediately made my pulse quicken. "For Emily if necessary." My mother's handwriting. I stared at it in disbelief. "She left this with you?" The woman nodded. 10 years ago." My mind raced. "Why?" Her eyes filled with sadness. "Because she believed one day you would begin asking the same questions she asked." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message was brief. "Emily, if you are reading this, then I was right. There is one person your father never stopped thinking about. Until you understand who she was, you will never understand him." Beneath the message was a name. The same name Frank had spoken in the diner. And for the first time, I realized my mother's investigation had never been about discovering a secret event. It had been about discovering a person. Part 5. The box in the attic. The drive home felt longer than usual. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside my mother's notebook, and every few miles I glanced at it as if the name written on that paper might somehow change. It never did. By the time I reached my house, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees. I carried everything inside and spread the documents across my dining room table. For hours I compared names, dates, addresses, and notes. The more I examined them, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. My mother had spent nearly a decade investigating this woman. Not casually. Not out of curiosity. She had devoted years of her life to understanding why this person remained so important to my father. The next morning I called the woman who had been my mother's friend. She answered on the second ring. "I knew you would call," she said. "There is more, is there not?" I asked. A long silence followed. "Yes," she replied. "Much more." 2 days later I found myself standing in front of my father's house. Walter had recovered remarkably well over the past year. Age had slowed him, but his mind remained sharp. As I walked up the front steps, I could not shake the feeling that everything was about to change again. My father opened the door and smiled when he saw me. "Emily." His expression warmed. "This is a surprise." For a moment I almost abandoned the entire investigation. We had worked so hard to rebuild our relationship. The thought of opening another painful chapter felt unfair. But the notebook in my hands reminded me why I was there. We spent nearly an hour talking about ordinary things before I finally gathered the courage to ask the question. "Dad," I said carefully, "have you ever heard the name Eleanor Hayes?" The reaction was immediate. The color drained from his face. His eyes widened slightly before he looked away. In all my years I had never seen him react like that. He did not speak. He simply stared toward the window. The silence lasted so long that I thought perhaps he had not heard me. Then he quietly said, "Where did you find that name?" My pulse quickened. "Mom's notebook." He closed his eyes. The room became completely still. "I was afraid of that," he whispered. For several seconds neither of us moved. Finally he stood and walked toward the staircase. Come with me. Confused, I followed him upstairs. We entered a spare bedroom that had not changed in decades. Old furniture filled the room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Walter crossed to the far corner and pointed upward toward a small attic access panel. There is a ladder in the closet, he said. I stared at him. What is up there? He hesitated. Something I should have dealt with years ago. 20 minutes later we stood inside the dusty attic. The air smelled faintly of old wood and cardboard. Boxes filled nearly every corner. Walter moved slowly through the narrow space until he stopped near the back wall. There, hidden beneath a faded blanket, sat a small wooden chest. My father looked at it for a very long time. Then, he quietly said, "Your mother found this years ago." My heart began pounding. Walter carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, letters, and keepsakes. The contents looked untouched. He reached inside and removed a photograph from the top of the stack. The moment he handed it to me, the air seemed to leave my lungs. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside a lake sometime in the early 1970s. She was smiling at the camera. Her hair, her eyes, the shape of her face, even her smile looked astonishingly familiar. It felt like looking at an older photograph of myself. I slowly lowered the picture and looked at my father. His expression carried decades of sorrow. Then he said the words I never expected to hear. "Emily, before I met your mother, I thought Eleanor Hayes was going to be the love of my life." Part 6. My father finally breaks. My father's words hung in the attic air long after he spoke them. I looked down at the photograph again. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The young woman standing beside the lake seemed strangely familiar, as though I had known her all my life without ever seeing her face. Walter sat heavily on an old wooden chair nearby and rubbed his hands together. For the first time since I began this investigation, he did not look defensive. He looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Like a man who had carried the same burden for half a century, and finally lacked the strength to hold it any longer. I carefully placed the photograph back inside the chest. "Who was she?" I asked quietly. Walter stared at the floor. "She was my best friend before she became anything else." His voice softened. "We met when we were teenagers. We grew up together. Everybody assumed we would eventually get married." I listened without interrupting. He slowly reached into the chest and removed another photograph. This one showed a group of young people standing outside a church. Eleanor stood beside him smiling. They looked happy. Comfortable. Familiar. "We made plans," he continued. "The kind of plans young people make when they believe life will unfold exactly the way they imagine." A sad smile crossed his face. Life had other ideas. For several moments he remained silent. Then he carefully handed me a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Most were addressed to him. Eleanor's handwriting covered every envelope. My pulse quickened. "Did Mom know about these?" I asked. Walter nodded. "She found them years ago." That answer surprised me. "She was not angry?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Your mother understood something that took me decades to understand myself." I waited. "She understood that grief and love are not the same thing." The words settled heavily between us. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the roof. The attic felt smaller now, filled with memories that had remained untouched for decades. "What happened?" I finally asked. Walter closed his eyes. "Circumstances changed. Families became involved. Expectations became complicated. Opportunities appeared in different places. One decision led to another. Before long, the future we imagined no longer existed." His explanation remained vague, but the pain in his voice felt genuine. "Then I met your mother." He smiled faintly. "She changed my life." That answer raised even more questions. If he loved my mother, why had Eleanor remained such an important presence in his thoughts? Almost as though he could read my mind, Walter answered before I spoke. "Your mother was the love of my adult life, Emily. Never doubt that." His eyes met mine. "But Eleanor became the symbol of every path I never took." I frowned slightly. "And that affected me somehow?" Walter looked away immediately. The question clearly made him uncomfortable. "Yes," he admitted. "More than it should have." Silence filled the attic. Then he stood and crossed toward the far corner. Beneath several old boxes sat another container, smaller than the chest, locked. My father stared at it for a long moment. "Your mother wanted me to open this years ago," he said quietly. "I never could." My heart began pounding again. "What is inside?" He laughed softly, but there was no humor in the sound. "The answer to the question your mother spent years asking." Slowly he removed a small key from his pocket. The sight startled me. "You have carried the key all this time?" Walter nodded. "For more than 30 years. Neither of us spoke as he inserted the key into the lock. The metal clicked. The lid opened. Inside rested a small collection of papers and several photographs. Resting on top was a single envelope. Unlike the others, this one had never been opened. My father stared at it with trembling hands. Across the front, written in Eleanor's handwriting, were words that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. To Walter. "Open only if you are finally ready to know the truth." Part 7. The truth my mother never finished writing. My father held the unopened envelope as though it contained the weight of an entire lifetime. Rain continued falling outside the attic while silence settled between us. For several moments he simply stared at Eleanor's handwriting. Then with a deep breath he carefully opened it. The paper inside had yellowed with age. The folds were fragile. Walter unfolded the letter slowly and began reading. At first his expression remained unreadable. Then I noticed something I had rarely seen from him. His eyes filled with tears. He sat down heavily and continued reading in silence. I waited. Minutes passed before he finally lowered the pages into his lap. "Dad?" I asked softly. He looked at me with an expression I could not fully understand. Relief, sadness, regret, gratitude. Somehow all of them existed at once. "Your mother knew," he whispered. My heart skipped. "Knew what?" Walter handed me the letter. "Everything." Carefully I began reading. Eleanor had written the letter more than 30 years earlier. Her words were calm and thoughtful. She described the years after their lives took different paths. She wrote about missed opportunities, difficult choices, and lessons learned with age. But one section immediately captured my attention. "Walter, if you are reading this, then perhaps you are finally ready to stop blaming yourself. The decision was never yours alone. We were both young. We were both afraid. We both believed we were protecting people we loved." I continued reading. The letter explained that neither of them had abandoned the future they once imagined because of betrayal or lack of love. Instead, circumstances beyond their control had gradually pushed them in different directions. Over time they accepted separate lives. Eleanor eventually found happiness elsewhere. So did Walter. Yet according to her letter, my father never forgave himself for the way everything unfolded. The next paragraph changed everything. "Your wife understands more than you realize. She visited me years ago. We spoke for hours. She asked difficult questions because she loved you. She was not searching for someone to blame. She was searching for the truth that you were unwilling to face." I stopped reading and looked up. Walter nodded slowly. "Your mother found Eleanor almost 10 years before she died." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "They met several times," he answered, "without telling me." The realization stunned me. My mother had not spent years investigating a rival from my father's past. She had been trying to help him heal. I looked back down at the letter. Eleanor described those conversations in remarkable detail. She praised my mother's kindness. She admired her strength. Most importantly, she repeatedly emphasized one point. Walter's greatest mistake was not what happened decades ago. His greatest mistake was allowing guilt to shape the way he viewed himself and everyone around him. Suddenly dozens of memories began fitting together. The emotional distance, the favoritism, the constant feeling that my father was holding part of himself back. It all seemed connected to a burden he never truly released. Near the end of the letter, Eleanor wrote something that made my chest tighten. "There is one thing your daughter deserves to know. If she reminds you of me, that is not her burden to carry. It is yours. Stop punishing yourself every time you look at her." I slowly lowered the page. The attic felt completely silent. Walter stared at the floor. "That is why," he said quietly. "Why what?" He swallowed hard. Why I struggled with you sometimes. My heart pounded. He looked up at me. Emily, every time I saw you growing up, I saw qualities that reminded me of someone I spent decades trying to forget. Not because I loved your mother less. Not because I loved you less. Because I never dealt with my own regrets. The honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. For the first time, I finally understood what my mother had been investigating. She was not searching for a hidden scandal. She was trying to uncover the emotional wound that quietly influenced our entire family. As I carefully folded Eleanor's letter, another item slipped from the envelope and landed on the floor. It was a photograph. Picked it up. On the back, written in Eleanor's handwriting, was a single sentence. If you truly want the whole story, ask Richard what he recently discovered. I stared at the words in disbelief. Somehow, my brother had become part of a mystery that began more than 50 years earlier. Part 8. The family meeting. The photograph remained in my hand during the entire drive home. Eleanor's message echoed in my mind again and again. If you truly want the whole story, ask Richard what he recently discovered. Nothing about that sentence made sense. Richard had never mentioned finding anything connected to our father's past. In fact, after the family business scandal had finally been resolved, he seemed determined to leave old secrets behind. Yet Eleanor had written those words decades ago. Somehow she believed my brother would eventually uncover something important. The following afternoon I called him. "Can we meet?" I asked. Richard immediately noticed the seriousness in my voice. Of course. 2 hours later we sat across from each other at a small cafe halfway between our homes. I brought my mother's notebook, Eleanor's letter, and the photograph. As soon as Richard saw the materials spread across the table, he let out a slow breath. "I was wondering when this would happen," he said. My stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable. "There is something I found a few months ago." I stared at him. "Why did you not tell me?" He rubbed his forehead. "Because I was not sure it mattered." That answer immediately told me it mattered very much. Richard reached into his briefcase and removed a thick folder. The sight of it made my pulse quicken. "After everything that happened last year," he explained, "I started organizing old family records, tax files, property documents, insurance papers. I wanted to make sure there were no more surprises." He opened the folder and carefully slid several pages across the table. Most appeared to be ordinary records. Then one document caught my eye. It was a copy of a letter written by our mother. The date was approximately 8 years before her death. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Inside one of Mom's storage boxes." I immediately began reading. The letter was addressed to a family counselor who had apparently worked with our mother for several years. One passage stood out immediately. "Walter does not realize that his silence affects both children differently. Richard receives reassurance. Emily receives distance. Neither understands why." I looked up. Richard nodded slowly. "Keep reading." The next paragraph made my chest tighten. "I believe Walter sees Emily as a reminder of unfinished grief, rather than unresolved love. Until he understands the difference, he will continue treating her unfairly without realizing it." I lowered the paper. Suddenly everything Eleanor had written seemed connected. My mother had reached the same conclusion years earlier. Richard opened another document. There is more. This time the pages contained notes written entirely in our mother's handwriting. She had been documenting conversations with counselors, family advisors, and trusted friends. The conclusion appeared repeatedly. Walter's behavior was rooted in guilt, not preference. For years I had believed my father simply loved Richard more. The evidence suggested something very different. My father had been fighting an internal battle that neither of us understood. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what finally changed my mind?" he asked. I shook my head. He pointed toward one specific note. "Mom wrote that I was never actually favored. I was simply easier for Dad to be around." The words landed heavily between us. For the first time I realized that Richard had suffered too. Not in the same way I had, but in his own way. He spent years carrying expectations he never asked for, while I spent years wondering why I never felt fully seen. Neither of us understood the real problem. We sat in silence for several moments. Then Richard surprised me. Dad needs to hear all of this. I nodded. I think so too. 3 days later, our family gathered together for the first time since the hospital revelations the previous year. Walter sat at the head of the table. Richard sat beside me. The notebook, letters, photographs, and records rested between us. One by one, every piece of the puzzle was placed in front of him. As the truth unfolded, I watched my father's expression slowly change. Not into fear. Not into defensiveness. Into understanding. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was finally seeing the full impact of a burden he had carried for more than 50 years. Part 9, The Last Letter. The family meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. By the time the last document had been read and the final letter placed back on the table, nobody in the room looked quite the same. My father sat quietly with his hands folded in front of him. Richard stared at the photographs. I looked at my mother's notebook resting beside Eleanor's letter, and realized that the two women who understood this story best were no longer there to witness its conclusion. Yet somehow they had guided us to this moment. The silence that filled the room was not uncomfortable. It felt reflective. Honest. Finally, Walter stood and walked toward a cabinet in the dining room. When he returned, he carried a plain white envelope. The paper looked old but carefully preserved. He held it in both hands before placing it in front of me. "What is this?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "Something I wrote years ago." I looked down at the envelope. My name appeared across the front in my father's handwriting. Emily. Nothing else. No date. No explanation. "You never gave it to me?" I asked. Walter shook his head. "I wrote it after your mother confronted me about the way I was treating you." The room became completely silent. My heart began beating faster. "Why did you keep it?" His eyes filled with regret. "Because writing the truth was easier than living it." For several seconds I could not move. Then I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning several pages. The first sentence immediately blurred through my tears. "Emily, there are things a father should say long before his daughter grows up." I continued reading. Line after line revealed emotions I had never heard from him directly. He described his fears, his regrets, and the guilt that had followed him for decades. Most importantly, he described me, not as a reminder of mistakes, not as a source of pain, but as the person who most resembled him. "You always asked the questions I avoided. You always challenged the stories I told myself. You always forced me to confront truths I preferred to ignore. For years I mistook that discomfort for something else. I thought perhaps I was protecting myself. In reality, I was hiding from myself." Tears slipped down my face as I continued reading. The letter contained no dramatic revelations, no shocking confessions. Instead, it offers something far more powerful. Honesty. Complete honesty. Near the end, one paragraph stood out above all the others. "Emily, if there is one thing I hope you understand, it is this. I never kept my distance because you were unworthy of love. I kept my distance because you reflected parts of me I was afraid to face. That was my failure, not yours." I lowered the pages and looked up. My father's eyes were fixed on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I stood and crossed the room. At 82 years old, Walter Parker looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker. Simply lighter. As though years of carrying invisible weight had finally come to an end. We embraced quietly while Richard watched from across the room. No grand speeches followed. None were necessary. The truth had already done its work. Several weeks later, our family gathered at the cemetery where my mother rested. Autumn had nearly given way to winter. The air was cool and the trees stood mostly bare. Richard placed flowers beside the headstone. I carried my mother's notebook. My father carried Eleanor's final letter. Together we stood in silence for several minutes. Then Walter placed the letter gently beside the flowers. "Thank you," he whispered. Whether he was speaking to my mother, Eleanor, or both, I could not say. Perhaps it did not matter. As we walked back toward our cars, I looked over my shoulder one final time. For years I believed the envelope my mother left behind contained the whole truth. I was wrong. The financial secrets, the hidden records, the buried history, none of those things represented the heart of the story. The real truth was far simpler and far more human. One man spent decades running from grief. One woman spent years trying to help him heal. Another woman offered forgiveness long before he could forgive himself. And one daughter finally learned that the pain she carried was never proof that she was unloved. It was evidence that those she loved were imperfect. As the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds and illuminated the cemetery grounds, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not victory. Not relief. Peace. The kind that arrives only when every hidden door has finally been opened. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for visiting.